On our second day on the road, we still had the goal of getting north to get away from the heat. So we basically blew through Arkansas in one day, making it to Memphis for the night. We did, however, take time to stop at a historical site in the capital city, Little Rock Central High School. In 1954, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled in Brown v. Board of Education that public education could no longer be segregated by race. The court didn't, however, specify a timeline for the desegregation. So many states in the South dragged their feet in making it a reality. It wasn't until 1957 that the Little Rock Nine attempted access to Central High School in Little Rock. After 3 weeks of facing angry mobs, yelling reporters, and armed soldiers, they were finally successful. The school itself is still an active school, attended by over 2,000 students. It just so happened that we visited on the first day of the new school year, so the scene was a little chaotic there. But nevertheless, we took our time going through the historical exhibits in the visitor center, visiting the restored mobile gas station across the street. This was where the reporters lined up to use the only payphone in the entire area to call their stories into their newspapers. And we snapped some pictures at the steps of the school. The entire experience was completely free, so if you're ever passing through Little Rock, I highly recommend stopping to experience this little slice of history. That night, we stayed at a Navy base near Memphis. I know, Navy? In Tennessee? Who would have thought? After hitting the commissary the next morning to restock our shelves with groceries, we headed out for a short drive to Jackson, Tennessee. Once we parked for the night, we did a walking tour of a nearby Civil War battlefield called the Battle of Parker's Crossroads. Now, as is pretty typical in the Deep South, there's a Civil War battlefield around nearly every corner. But nonetheless, we found this one quite interesting. General Forrest was the commanding officer for the Confederacy. The boys thought it was pretty cool that Forrest Gump was named after a real Civil War hero, not just a fictional one invented for the movie. Well, General Forrest was winning for most of the battle on December 31st, 1862, completely surrounding the forces of Colonel Dunham, the Union officer. However, Union forces under Colonel Fuller arrived with reinforcements, causing the Union to ultimately win this battle. This historical trail was rather long, so we walked only the first stop and the last stop. But we saw lots of Tennessee rolling fields and hills, as well as a log cabin and the burial site of 30 Union soldiers. Their remains were reinterred at a national cemetery in later years. This was a really nice example of local history. That evening, we relaxed a little bit at the campground. Even though we had been busy for most of the day, boys still have a lot of energy. So we took advantage of the driving range that was at the nearby campground and hit a few balls. The next morning, we did a few things in Jackson, Tennessee. We started the day by touring a university as a potential place for one of the boys. After the campus tour, we went to see the home of the legendary Casey Jones. He was a railroad engineer, notorious for always being on time. But on April the 30th, 1900, his attempt to bring a late-arriving 382 train into the station on time ended tragically. But through his heroic actions, he was able to save every passenger's life while sacrificing his own. It's the kind of stuff that legends are made of. The next day, we left Jackson, heading for Nashville. Although Nashville is known for the Grand Ole Opry and country music, we bypassed most attractions since our family isn't particularly well versed in that musical genre. Instead, we decided to do some sightseeing at the Hermitage. The Hermitage was a cotton and tobacco plantation of our country's 7th president, General Andrew Jackson. The boys were finally able to figure out who he was when I told them that he's the guy on the $20 bill who looks a little bit like Sylvester Stallone. He really is a fascinating person, and we all learned so much about him while we were there. Andrew Jackson was a rather enigmatic figure. He was much loved by the common man as one of their own. I should say, the common white man. He was deeply religious and completely devoted to his wife and his family. He was a war hero from the Battle of New Orleans during the War of 1812. But on the other hand, he owned 150 slaves, and he had no qualms about it. He had utter disdain for women's rights and equality, and he was downright barbaric in his treatment of the Native Americans, as the Cherokee relocation, also known as the Trail of Tears, occurred under his direct order. We started in the visitor center viewing some displays and a movie of his life. And then we each had an age-appropriate personal audio tour while it guided us through the grounds of the plantation. The highlight, of course, was touring inside the mansion. Photography is not allowed inside the mansion, but I can tell you that even in this day and age, that mansion is quite ornate and opulent. I can only imagine what visitors thought of it back in the day. After Nashville, we drove to Pigeon Forge, and what a wonderful time we had at the most frequently visited national park in the United States, the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. The Great Smoky Mountains National Park was established in the 1930s due to the environmental threat from the logging industry. These majestic, old-growth forests were being threatened by an industry that was booming due to Americans' needs for wooden products. The forest was disappearing quickly, and soil erosion was the result. The mountainsides were literally washing away. Not only that, but the natural habitat for many creatures was being disrupted, most notably the American black bear. So, in 1926, Congress authorized the park, and it was established in 1934. The park was among the first national parks assembled from the purchase of private lands. As a result, many of the original log cabins and country churches and one-room schoolhouses are still standing and preserved in the park today. We didn't do anything touristy the day we arrived. We just got ourselves hooked up in the campground nearby. But the next morning, we headed into the national park. After stopping at the visitor center, we spent the rest of the morning touring through Cades Cove. This is where you get a good taste of Appalachia and the lifestyle of the so-called hillbillies. The entire driving tour lasted most of the day, but we saw many original log cabins and all of their associated outbuildings, several country churches with hillside graveyards, and a few mills, not to mention breathtaking views of the Appalachian Mountains. The next day, we took a different road through the park called the Newfound Gap Road. This route takes you up the Tennessee side to the peak of the mountain ridge and back down again on the North Carolina side. Along the top ridge of the Smoky Mountains is part of the Appalachian Trail, which runs over 2,000 miles and stretches from Maine all the way to Georgia. We hiked for a little way along the trail just to say we did it. One turn off the Newfound Gap Road, and we found ourselves at the highest peak in the park, Clingman's Dome, with an elevation of 6,643 feet. We huffed and puffed our way up a very steep half-mile trail to get to an observation tower, but it was very worth the hike. And it was a bit cold up there. We were up in the clouds after all. After Clingman's Dome, we came down the other side of the mountains on the North Carolina side, and we found our way to a working mill, a mountain farm museum, and another visitor's center where our son received his Junior Ranger badge, which he proudly wore during the rest of our visit. The next day, we needed to spend a little bit of time getting groceries and doing housekeeping. There's just no escaping it. But in the afternoon, we took one last jaunt through the park on the Roaring Fork Motor Nature Trail. This is a narrow, one-lane, one-way, curvy, twisty road through a section of the park. The speed limit's only 10 miles an hour, in which I sometimes wondered if we were going to fall off the side of the road and down the mountain. Again, there were many historic buildings to stop and see along the way. One highlight of the Roaring Fork was when we stopped at a trailhead and hiked a mile and a half up the mountain to a grotto waterfall. It was simply breathtaking, and the water was so cold and crystal clear. We spent some time there before we headed back down the mountain, another mile and a half. We didn't see any bears on this trail, but there was plenty of fresh evidence that bears had been on the trail recently. We had to watch our step.
What happened?
Oh, my shoes are wet.
What?
My clothes and my shoes are wet.
Our time in Pigeon Forge came to a close. Pigeon Forge and neighboring Gatlinburg are very touristy areas and look like a lot of fun. But no, we didn't go to Dollywood. That was a bummer. Because of budgeting concerns, we stayed disciplined, and we only did things in the free national park. Although, I have to admit, we did hit the Russell Stover's chocolate candy outlet store on our way back to the interstate highway. That wraps up our journey through Arkansas and Tennessee. Follow us for our adventure as we journey into Kentucky next. Like and subscribe, tell your friends.